How do you bring a powerful civilization to its knees without conquering it? You flood it with drugs and crumble it from within. This is how Britain nearly destroyed China with opium. In the early 1800s, China was really powerful and extremely wealthy. The Qing dynasty ruled over a vast empire with hundreds of millions of people. China had been one of the world's leading civilizations for thousands of years. It invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. The government was organized. It was rich. Its economy was strong. The people were prosperous. Across the whole world, China was admired. Chinese products were considered luxury goods. The silk was worn by royals and officials. The porcelain was so good that it became known as fine china. Spices were exported all over the world. The tea was tasty and in demand throughout. In Britain, tea was more than just a drink. It was a daily habit and a cultural symbol. British society depended on it. But China didn't depend on Britain. So, where did the problem arise? China didn't want British goods. It didn't need them. Instead, China demanded silver as payment. Every year, massive amounts of British silver flowed into China. British leaders watched the reserve shrink and panicked. They needed a way to reverse the trade imbalance. Instead of respecting China's laws, Britain chose profit. They chose opium. Britain controlled large parts of India, where opium poppies grew easily. Opium is a highly addictive drug. It creates pleasure, but like any drug, it leads to dependence and suffering. China already knew how dangerous it was. The drug had already been banned decades earlier, but Britain ignored the ban. And why wouldn't they? All they wanted was wealth, so the British officials turned opium into a system. Indian farmers were forced to grow poppies instead of food. The East India Company bought the opium cheaply, processed it, and sold it at auctions. Private traders didn't smuggle it into China randomly. It was all part of a much bigger plan. At first, opium spread through port cities. Sailors and merchants used it. Then, it moved inland. Opium dens appeared everywhere. People from every social class became addicted. Workers stopped working. Soldiers grew weak. Families spent all their money on the drug. The system started breaking. China began to collapse from the inside. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese people were addicted. Silver that used to come into China had now begun flowing out of the country to pay for opium. Britain's trade crisis vanished. China's economy weakened. Chinese officials warned the emperor. Laws were passed. Smugglers were punished. Nothing worked. The supply never stopped because Britain controlled production. In 1839, the emperor finally acted. He appointed Lin Zhehu, a strict and honest official, to end the opium trade. Lin shut down dens. He arrested dealers. Then, he tried something else. He appealed to morality. Lin wrote a letter to Britain's queen. He asked a simple question. If drugs were illegal in Britain because they harmed people, why was Britain selling them to China? The British reacted by not replying. Were they being rude, or did they just not care? Lin realized words were not enough. He surrounded foreign merchants in Canton and demanded they surrender all opium. Over 20,000 chests were handed over. Lin ordered them destroyed publicly. The drug was dissolved and flushed into the sea. China believed it had finally defended itself. Britain saw it as an attack on profit. British officials claimed China had destroyed British property. They ignored the fact that opium was illegal. And in 1840, Britain sent warships. The First Opium War had begun. And was it a fair fight? Not at all. Britain had steam-powered ships and modern cannons. China had outdated weapons and little naval experience. British ships bombarded ports. Cities fell one by one. China was defeated. In 1842, China forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which paid enormous sums of silver and opened ports to foreign control. British citizens were placed above Chinese law. Hong Kong was also taken. The opium trade continued on. Soon, Britain wanted more. In the 1850s, a minor ship incident became an excuse for another war. Britain and France attacked China together. This came to be known as the Second Opium War. Foreign troops marched towards Beijing. Along the way, they destroyed defenses and occupied cities. And in 1860, they had reached the outskirts of the capital. It was then followed by the humiliation that China would never forget. British and French troops looted and burned the old summer palace. one of the most beautiful cultural sites on Earth. Art, books, and history were stolen or destroyed. The fires burned for days. Even foreign soldiers were horrified. China wasn't just defeated, but badly humiliated as well. New treaties followed. More ports were opened. Foreign diplomats moved into Beijing. Opium was legalized. More land was taken. China lost control over its laws, trade, and borders. By the late 1800s, the damage was catastrophic. Millions were addicted to opium. Some estimates suggest a huge portion of adult men used it regularly. Families collapsed. Productivity vanished. Silver drained from the economy. The government went bankrupt, and China became vulnerable. And guess what happened then? Other powers rushed in. Russia seized land. Germany claimed territory. Japan defeated China and took Taiwan. Britain carried on with their operations. All of this sliced the country into foreign-controlled zones, and that period became known as the Century of Humiliation. The Qing dynasty never recovered from that. Rebellions erupted. Millions died in internal wars. In 1912, the dynasty collapsed. China fell into chaos, ruled by warlords and foreign pressure. Opium addiction continued for decades. But the damage wasn't only physical or economic. China had lost its confidence. For centuries, Chinese leaders believed their system could protect the country. The Opium Wars shattered that belief. China realized it had fallen behind a rapidly changing world, and that realization was painful. Different governments tried to fix the damage. Some attempted reforms. Others failed. Foreign powers still controlled key ports and trade routes. China remained weak and divided. What made things worse was memory. Families remembered addiction. Communities remembered hunger. Stories of burned palaces and stolen treasures were passed down. The history lessons hardened into caution. Never be weak again. When a new government finally took control in the mid-20th century, it treated the opium crisis as a symbol of national failure. Ending drug addiction became a priority. Traffickers were punished harshly because the government wanted to erase every reminder of foreign domination. But removing drugs was only the beginning. China also learned that military power alone wasn't enough. Economic weakness had invited invasion. So, economic strength became a priority. Factories, infrastructure, education, and trade became shields. The mindset still shapes China today. They invest heavily in the world and their own land, so they cannot be pressured the way they once were. It builds trade relationships, due to which it cannot be isolated. China remembers how free trade was once enforced at gunpoint. The opium era also changed how they viewed morality in global politics, and with hardship comes ease. To many Chinese people, the Opium Wars proved that powerful nations will justify anything when profit is involved. Words like freedom and trade meant nothing when addiction destroyed lives. Britain gained wealth from opium, but China gained memory, and memory lasts. When China speaks today about sovereignty and strength, it's not abstract. It comes from experience. The opium story is an ancient history in China. It's a lesson built in national identity. They learned to overcome this because they remembered it all. A civilization nearly destroyed by addiction didn't forget who pushed it there. China survived the opium catastrophe. Barely. And it will never allow itself to be that vulnerable again.